November 5th is just around the corner, and both campaigns are making their final push across the battleground states. Both candidates are on defense. Former President Trump has been distancing himself from these comments made at his rally at Madison Square Garden.
I don't know if you guys know this, but there's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah, I think it's called Puerto Rico.
Meanwhile, Vice President Kamala Harris is distancing herself from comments made by President Biden, in which he appeared to refer to Trump supporters as garbage. Will either of these instances sway undecided voters? Here to go on the record is Scott Tranter, the Director of Data Science from Decision Desk HQ. Scott, want to dive right into it and start off with those comments from comedian Tony Hinchcliffe, which we heard in that clip. How are voters responding to those, quite frankly, racist comments about Puerto Ricans and Latinos in general? And is it having any impact with former President Trump's standing with the Latino vote?
Yeah, so we've seen some relatively high profile celebrity endorsements of Trump pull it back because of that. It's, with 5-6 days to go before the election, it's really hard to measure any impact in any sort of certainty. But we do know this: there's about 500,000 Puerto Ricans who live in Pennsylvania. There's obviously anywhere from 1.5 million, 2 million in Florida. And they're a voting bloc that Donald Trump had been making inroads in, and we had seen it based on him being able to get a larger percentage of the Hispanic vote than in previous cycles. So, to expect that to recede back a little bit is not unreasonable given all this, but we're so close it's hard to know for certain until we actually count those votes.
On the flip side, we know that the Harris campaign is sort of on the defense and on cleanup duty after President Biden faced backlash just a week ahead of the election after appearing to call Trump supporters garbage. We know that the White House has clarified those remarks, saying he meant the speakers at Trump's Madison Square Garden rally. But is this something the Harris campaign really should be worried about in the final days? I mean, Scott, to me, this sort of harkens back to Hillary Clinton's deplorable comments ahead of the 2016 election.
Yeah, that reminds me of that too. Look, this is not what either campaign wants to be talking about, whether it's a comment made about Puerto Ricans or a comment made about supporters of the opponent. I definitely think that this is the last days of the campaign, so everyone's hanging on everything. This has obviously been an emotional, highly emotionally charged campaign. So everyone's getting a little bit crazy at the end, Julia. I don't think either campaign wants to be talking about this, but we'll see how it affects them because it's certainly dominating the news cycle.
It certainly is, and crazy is certainly an understatement here. But look, I want to look to what we call the undecided voters. How many, quote unquote, undecided voters are there truly left? I mean, are these voters that are legitimately undecided between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, or is it more of a question of these voters definitely lean towards a candidate, but it's a question of do they choose the couch or the polls on election day?
You stole the words right out of my mouth. I don't think there are that many undecided voters on a candidate. They're just undecided whether they're going to show up. Right. And at the end of the day, that's the most important part, because when we do these polls, or anyone does these polls, you assume that whoever responds to you and when you model it out is going to show up. But what we always know is not every voter who tells you who they're going to vote for, who intends to vote, actually does. And I think, we've been talking about it all year long. Most voters don't really like either candidate very much. And they're not excited to vote for either candidate other than the core of each other's bases. So we'll see. The ultimate undecided voter is are they going to get up on Tuesday? They're going to show up and vote, or they're going to say, yeah, I don't like either of these people.
We've seen this gender divide play out over the past few weeks, men leaning towards Trump, women leaning more towards Harris. The Harris campaign very much trying to win over younger men in particular. But we know that many of Vice President Harris's allies argue that it's women that could get her over the finish line despite that gender divide playing out. How critical are women ultimately to to a Harris victory, I should say?
They're very critical. That's a segment of the population that she is doing well in, anywhere between 10 and 12, maybe 13 points better than Donald Trump. She needs to run up the score there, especially if it appears that she's giving up a certain percentage to African American voters and Hispanic voters to Donald Trump. The male divide's obviously something her campaign's been aware of since she jumped in. They've got the various coalition groups in and around that. Some she's tried to address. This is one of those elections where we're seeing new coalitions and new trend lines emerge. This is not something we had seen in elections past, and so it's going to scramble some people's expectations and maybe lead to a couple surprises on election night.
Harris made her closing argument to voters at the Ellipse outside of the White House. Scott, do you think she was able to close the deal and ultimately change any minds?
I got caught in traffic trying to come back from something from that, and that's how I knew it was on. And I think that's probably how a lot of Americans thought about it too. Donald Trump did his rally at Madison Square Garden. That got a little bit of news. If you're into him, you were watch that. If you're a Harris voter, you knew what she was doing on the Capitol. She obviously chose that spot because it highlighted protect democracy. The January 6th angle she's going. I don't necessarily think it broke through like either campaigns thought it would. It was just a good base rallying tactic, which is good at this. You got to get out the vote. So by and large, it was good for get out the vote. I don't know that it really changed any minds.
So I want to move towards some of Decision Desk HQ forecasting and data. We know that since the end of September, forecasting has shown Harris's chances dropped 10% from a high of 56%. The vice president currently has a 46% chance of winning now, according to DDHQ. But Scott, is there any last minute polling that could, or any other outside factors that could essentially have a major impact on your forecasting?
Yeah, I think, we're gonna get probably the last wave of public polls over the next, over the weekend. I imagine we'll get a few. Most of them will come in Saturday and Sunday, the ones that are gonna come out the last weekend. And I'm most interested to see what we see, if we see any outlier polls, or I guess outlier is a strong word, but see if we can see a few polls pushing one candidate over the edge in Pennsylvania. Right now we got that one at 50-50. See if there's any movement in North Carolina or Georgia. But by and large, I think these lines are relatively set. We might see it move a point or two, but at this point, we just got to sit and wait and see the vote count.
So on election night, or the days after election, depending on when it gets called, what does each candidate's path to victory look like? Hypothetically, if Harris loses Georgia and North Carolina, those two very critical Sunbelt states, does she still have a chance?
She does. She's got to pull an inside straight, though. She's got to win all three of the upper Midwestern states: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. Donald Trump's best path is win all the 2020 states, but flip Georgia and Pennsylvania. And then, in that sense, he can even lose Wisconsin and Michigan if he wins those two and still be the president. So, both candidates have a path to victory. And the common denominator, it runs through, the upper Midwest, specifically Pennsylvania, and it'll start the night off by both candidates trying to see if they can flip or hold a Georgia, North Carolina.
And on that note about Pennsylvania, we know that Trump has campaigned heavily in the Keystone State. Is that state his only path to victory if Harris can keep the rest of the blue wall states, meaning Michigan and Wisconsin?
That is his easiest path. There are a couple other paths. If he wins Georgia, North Carolina, and he loses, well, I guess the math kind of works out either way. It is pretty much in 95% of the scenarios you got to have Pennsylvania. A few of the weird ones come in when New Hampshire flips a certain way, or a Minnesota or Virginia or something like that. But yeah, by and large, it's that upper Midwest that is going to be the key for either candidate.
So we've talked about presidential for most of this segment, but we know that also control of Congress is hanging in the balance. What's your outlook on the House? I mean, it seems like it's a real toss-up at this point.
Yeah, right now our forecast has projected 218 seats, was what you need for the majority. I'm pretty sure it's not going to land on 218 seats. It's going to be, probably 5 or 6 seats one way or the other. The fundraising looked good for the Democrats coming into the stretch, but that generic ballot looks really good for the Republicans coming into voting day. I think the Republicans are feeling a little bit more bullish about their chances of keeping the House. And the Democrats are equally as bullish. So I think one side is going to be pretty surprised on election night, and I shouldn't say election night. I think the House will be called a week to 2 weeks later with some races that are still being counted and finished up in California and out west.
And it seems that the Senate might be an easier call. We know that Republicans have had an advantage with that map, particularly with Montana. Incumbent Senator John Tester not polling as well. Democrats obviously worried about their chances of keeping control of the upper chamber. So in addition to Montana, what other races should our viewers be looking out for in the Senate?
That Ohio race, Bernie Moreno, when he opened up and he won the primary this year, he was an underdog. He's a 1-3 underdog. Now he is in our forecast inched up. He's about a 55% slight favorite to win that seat. Sherrod Brown's a great candidate. Been fighting hard all year long. If the Democrats are able to hold that seat, and they're able to hold the upper Midwestern seats, it theoretically could happen. They could hold off Sheehy in Montana, but basically the deck is stacked for the Republicans. I think the best the Democrats can hope for now is keeping the GOP majority to probably somewhere in the 51, maybe 52 seat majority for them. There's just too much momentum on the Republican side. Yeah, I'll be watching Ohio on election night because that'll set the tone for what kind of final seat count we're going to get for the GOP.
That would be an incredible upset, Sherrod Brown being the last statewide elected Democrat in ruby red Ohio. So certainly something to watch. Scott Tranter, as always, thank you, and I hope you're keeping your head above water and getting some rest.
Just a little bit.
Thanks, Scott. And that's it for What's America Thinking. I'm Julia Manchester. Come back next week. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hills YouTube channel.